My name is Megan Foster. I am a senior executive at Rowan Technologies. I had worked there for almost 9 years, and in that time, I had built projects from nothing. I had turned small ideas into real products. I was proud of that. I still am. The office was mostly empty at that hour. A cleaning cart sat parked near the elevators, and somewhere down the hall, a coffee machine hissed as it warmed up for the day. I liked being early. It was the only time the building felt like it belonged to me instead of to 50 other people chasing the same promotions and the same corner offices. I had joined Rowan Technologies, straight out of graduate school, back when the company was smaller and less polished. Back then, ideas moved fast, and nobody cared much about titles. Over the years, the company had grown into something bigger, glossier, and far more political. I had grown with it, learning how to survive in rooms full of people who smiled while they competed against you. That morning, I did not know my whole world was about to shift. I had a big presentation ready for the quarterly board meeting. It was called Project Horizon, and it was my idea from the very beginning. I had spent 4 months on it. Late nights, missed dinners, weekends at my desk instead of at the park with my sister's kids. I believed in it completely. Brady Collins was my boss. He was also vying for the CEO role, and everyone in the office knew it. He was smart, no doubt, but he was also hungry in a way that made people nervous. He smiled a lot, but his eyes rarely matched his smile. That day, in the big glass conference room, I watched Brady stand up and present my idea as his own. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He spoke about Project Horizon like he had built it brick by brick. He used my words, my charts, my exact phrasing about client retention and long-term growth. I sat there, frozen, unable to say a single word. I remember the small details more than anything else. The way the projector light flickered slightly on the screen. The way one of the board members nodded along, impressed, tapping his pen against a leather notebook. The way Brady paused for effect right before revealing the client retention numbers. Exactly the way I had rehearsed pausing in front of my bathroom mirror the night before. It was surreal, watching someone perform your own work back to you, complete with your pacing and your emphasis, as if he had studied a recording of me practicing alone in my apartment. Nobody in that room knew the truth. Not the board members, not the other executives. Only I knew, and I could not prove it in that moment without looking foolish or bitter. After the meeting ended, Brady walked past me. He leaned in close, like he wanted to share something friendly. "You're not cut out for this, Megan," he whispered. Those words stayed with me the entire day. I kept replaying them in my head, again and again, like a song stuck on repeat. I went home that night and sat on my couch for almost 2 hours without turning on the television. I did not cry. I was too angry to cry. I just sat there, thinking about every late night I had spent building that idea and how easily he had taken it from me. The next morning, I was not invited to the follow-up strategy meeting, the one where the real decisions about Project Horizon would be made. I found out through a calendar notification that popped up by accident, showing a meeting I was never included in. I stood outside that meeting room, watching through the glass wall. Brady sat at the head of the table. My idea was on the screen behind him. And I was standing in the hallway like a stranger in my own company. That night, I called my old mentor, a retired executive named Odette Marsh, who had guided me through my first few years at Rowan Technologies before she left to consult independently. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but she picked up on the second ring, like she somehow knew I needed to talk. "You sound tired," she said, before I had even explained anything. I told her everything, the stolen presentation, the whispered insult, the meeting I wasn't invited to. She listened quietly, the way she always did, letting me finish before she said a word. "You have 2 paths here," Odette finally said. "You can fight loud, or you can fight smart. Loud feels good for about a day. Smart wins in the long run, though it takes patience most people don't have." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up the phone. That was the moment something changed in me. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I started thinking clearly. I am not someone who screams in hallways or sends angry emails. That was never who I was. I believed in patience. I believed in doing things the right way. But I also believed that truth has a way of surfacing, if you give it the right conditions to grow. I decided I would not attack Brady directly. I would not walk into HR and make accusations I could not fully prove. That would only make me look desperate, and worse, it would make me look exactly like what he had called me. not cut out for this. Instead, I thought about the people who actually mattered. The clients. Project Horizon had already been piloted with 3 of our biggest clients. They had seen the early results. They had spoken with the team. They knew, in some way, how the project had come together, even if they didn't know the full details of who did what. I made a list of names, people I trusted, people who had worked closely with me during the pilot phase. The first name on my list was Carla Whitfield, a procurement director at a logistics firm that had been one of our earliest partners for Project Horizon. Carla was sharp. She noticed things other people missed. I called her not to complain, but simply to check in, the way I always did after a major project phase. Carla, hi, it's Megan. I wanted to follow up on how things are settling in on your end. Megan, good timing. We were just talking about your project internally. Very impressive work. I felt a small twist in my stomach at the word your, because I knew, at least internally within Rowan, credit had already shifted elsewhere. That's wonderful to hear, I said. I'm curious, actually. During the board presentation last week, who did you understand was leading the innovation on that initiative? There was a small pause on the line. Honestly, we assumed it was a team effort, but the way it was presented to us, it sounded like Brady had spearheaded most of it. Was that not accurate? I did not answer directly. I simply said, I think it's always worth asking these questions, especially for a project this important. I was wondering if you noticed any inconsistencies in how the project evolved, compared to what you saw in the early pilot phase. Carla went quiet for a moment. Now that you mention it, some of the early technical decisions felt different from what we discussed with you directly. The tone changed a bit after the leadership transition on your side. I thanked her for her time and told her I appreciated her honesty. I did not push further. I let the seed sit there, in her mind, waiting to grow on its own. The next call was to Omar Reyes, an operations manager at a manufacturing company that had also piloted Project Horizon. Omar was more direct than Carla, and I knew he would ask sharper questions if given the chance. Omar, it's Megan Foster. Do you have a few minutes? Always, Megan. What's going on? I wanted to check how the transition into full deployment is going on your end. Any concerns? Actually, yes. Some of your team's early documentation didn't match what we saw presented at the recent industry conference. The strategy sounded slightly different when Brady spoke about it. That surprised me a little, because I had not expected Brady to present externally without me knowing. Interesting, I said. I wasn't aware that Brady spoke about it at a conference. Do you happen to remember what he said about the origin of the idea? He said it came from a leadership brainstorm session. Didn't mention any specific person, honestly. I see. Well, I think it's worth reviewing the actual documentation from the pilot phase, just so the record stays accurate for future planning. I wouldn't want any confusion to affect your rollout. Omar agreed, and said he would loop in his internal compliance team to review documentation history, since accuracy mattered for their internal audits. I did not tell him to do that. I simply planted a small, reasonable concern, and let him make his own decision. The third client I reached out to was Ingrid Sorensen, a finance director who had been skeptical of Project Horizon from the beginning, but had eventually become one of its strongest supporters once she saw the results. Ingrid was different from the other two. She was cautious by nature, and she rarely trusted things without verifying them herself. Megan, good to hear from you. I have to say, the project has performed even better than expected. That's great news, Ingrid. I'm glad it's working well for your team. Brady mentioned during our last call that he personally redesigned the framework after the initial version underperformed. Was that true? That was the first time I heard the exact lie stated so plainly, and it stung more than I expected. I wasn't aware the initial version underperformed, I said carefully. From what I remember, the early results were actually strong from day one. I was wondering if you still had the original performance report we sent over. It might be worth comparing timelines, just to keep our internal records consistent. You know, Ingrid added, before I could end the call, when we first evaluated this project, you were the one who walked us through every technical detail. You answered questions nobody else on your team could answer. I remember that clearly. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I kept my voice even. I appreciate you remembering that, Ingrid. I just don't like when timelines get rewritten after the fact, she said. It makes me question what else might have been rewritten. Ingrid said she still had it saved and promised to pull it up when she had time. I ended the call there. I did not need to say anything more. Ingrid was the kind of person who, once she started digging, would not stop until she found the full picture. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued this pattern. I never accused Brady, I never raised my voice. I never sent a single email that could be used against me later. I simply asked questions, the kind of questions any responsible executive should be asking anyway, about accuracy, documentation, and consistency. Meanwhile, at the office, things looked normal on the surface. Brady walked around like a man who already had the CEO position secured. He smiled at people in the hallway. He made small jokes during meetings. He treated me the same way he always had, mostly ignoring me unless he needed something specific from my department. I kept my head down. I did my work. I stayed professional in every meeting, even the ones where Brady casually took credit for smaller decisions that were mine. At night, I started keeping a small notebook by my bed, writing down anything relevant I remembered about Project Horizon's early development. Dates, conversations, names of people who had reviewed early drafts. It wasn't for anyone else. It was simply a way to keep my thoughts organized, while everything else in my professional life felt chaotic. My sister called one evening, asking why I sounded distracted. I told her I was just dealing with a difficult project at work, nothing more. I didn't want to worry her with the details, and honestly, I wasn't sure yet how the whole situation would end. Some nights, I doubted myself. I wondered if I was being too passive, if I should simply confront Brady directly and get it over with. But every time that thought crossed my mind, I remembered Odette's advice, and I reminded myself that patience was not the same as weakness. There was one person at the office who noticed something was different about me. Her name was Naomi Okafor, and she worked in client relations. We had become close over the years, mostly through shared frustration during long project cycles. "You've been quiet lately," Naomi said one afternoon as we waited for coffee in the small kitchen near my office. "I've had a lot on my mind," I said. "Is this about Project Horizon?" I looked around to make sure no one else was nearby. "Let's just say I'm letting some things take their natural course." Naomi raised an eyebrow, but she did not push further. She had worked with me long enough to know that when I said something like that, I usually had a plan already in motion. 3 weeks after my calls began, I started noticing small shifts. Carla sent an email to our sales director, asking for clarification on who had led the technical architecture of Project Horizon during its earliest phase. She copied 2 other people from her company, which meant the question was no longer private. Omar's compliance team requested a full documentation history for the project, going back to the initial proposal stage. That request landed directly on Brady's desk, and I heard through the office grapevine that he had seemed unusually stressed that day. Ingrid, true to her cautious nature, compared the original performance report with the version Brady had referenced during his conference talk. She found several inconsistencies, including a claim that the framework had been completely redesigned, when in reality, the core structure remained almost identical to my original proposal. She raised this concern directly with her own leadership team, and word of it eventually made its way back to Rowan Technologies through informal channels, the way sensitive information always seems to travel in corporate environments. Around the office, Brady started acting differently, though most people probably didn't notice it the way I did. He stayed later than usual. He asked his assistant, a quiet young man named Felix Dunmore, to pull old project files that hadn't been touched in months. Once, I passed his office and saw him staring at his computer screen with the kind of stillness that told me he was reading something he did not want to be reading. I did not orchestrate a scandal. I did not need to. I had simply given honest, reasonable people enough space to notice the truth on their own. Around this time, the board began preparing for the final decision on the CEO transition. There were 2 main candidates being discussed, Brady Collins and a quieter contender named Victor Lang, who ran the international division and rarely sought attention. I was not part of that conversation directly, but I heard updates through Naomi, who always seemed to know more than anyone expected her to know. There's talk that some of the client feedback on Project Horizon hasn't been entirely positive, Naomi told me one evening as we left the office together. Apparently there are concerns about consistency in reporting. "Is that so?" I said, trying to sound neutral, even though inside I felt something shift into place. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I smiled, just slightly. "I only know what I read in the reports, same as everyone else." Naomi laughed and shook her head. "Sure, Megan, sure." The following week, I was finally invited back into the Project Horizon meetings. Not because Brady wanted me there, but because the board had specifically requested my presence, given my original role in the project's development. Helena Cross, the chair of the board, called a smaller meeting with just a handful of senior leaders. I walked into that room with a strange mix of nerves and quiet confidence. "Megan," Helena said, "we've been reviewing some client concerns related to Project Horizon. There seem to be inconsistencies in how the origin and development of the project have been represented externally." I kept my expression calm. "I'm happy to walk through the full documentation history, if that would help clarify things." "That would be appreciated," Helena said. "We want to make sure our external partners have full confidence in our internal processes, especially heading into this leadership transition." I spent the next hour walking the board through every stage of Project Horizon, from the earliest concept notes to the final pilot results. I did not mention Brady's name once in an accusatory way. I simply presented facts, dates, and documentation. The truth, when laid out clearly, did not need me to raise my voice. Brady sat at the far end of the table during that meeting. I watched his expression shift from confident to uncertain, and eventually to something closer to controlled panic, though he tried hard not to show it. When Helena asked him directly about the conference presentation, where he claimed to have redesigned the framework himself, he hesitated for the first time since I had known him. "I may have oversimplified the origin story for the sake of a shorter presentation," he said. "It wasn't meant to mislead anyone." Helena did not respond immediately. She simply made a note and moved on to the next topic. After that meeting, things at Rowan Technologies began to shift quickly. 2 more clients reached out independently, asking for clarification on project ownership and technical credit. It seemed my earlier conversations had created ripples that extended beyond the 3 people I had originally spoken with. People talk. Executives talk to other executives. Once a small doubt is planted, it tends to travel on its own. Around that same time, I ran into Victor Lang near the parking garage one evening. We had never spoken much before since our departments rarely overlapped, but he stopped to talk that night. "Long day?" he asked, adjusting his jacket against the wind coming off the river. "Long few weeks, honestly," I said. "I've heard a bit about the questions surrounding Project Horizon," he said carefully. "I won't pretend I know all the details, but I respect how you've handled things. No noise, no drama, just facts." "Facts tend to hold up better than noise," I said. Victor smiled slightly. "That's a good way to lead a company, if you ask me." I didn't think much of the comment at the time, but looking back, it was one of the first signs that the people who mattered most were paying closer attention than I realized. Brady tried to control the narrative internally. He scheduled meetings with department heads, attempting to reinforce his version of events. But the documentation did not support him, and more importantly, the clients themselves had already started asking the same uncomfortable questions. I never once had to defend myself loudly. The facts did that work for me. A month later, the board made its final decision regarding the CEO transition. I was not in the room when they discussed it, but I received a message from Helena Cross asking me to come to her office that afternoon. I walked in, unsure of what to expect. "Megan, please sit," Helena said. I sat down, my hands folded in my lap, trying to appear calmer than I felt. "The board has decided to move forward with Victor Lang as the new CEO," she said. "But that's not the only decision we made." I waited. "Given the documentation review and the client feedback we received, the board also decided that your contributions to Project Horizon and several other initiatives over the years have not been properly recognized. We are promoting you to Senior Vice President of Innovation, effective immediately." I did not know what to say. I had hoped for acknowledgement, but I had not expected something so significant. "Thank you," I finally said. "I appreciate the board's confidence." "You earned it," Helena said, "and frankly, the way you handled this entire situation without creating unnecessary conflict said a lot about your leadership style." That mattered to the board. As for Brady, he was not fired outright. Rowan Technologies rarely did anything that dramatic in public view. Instead, his role was quietly restructured. He was moved to a regional division with less visibility and fewer direct reports. On paper, it looked like a lateral move. In reality, everyone in the company understood exactly what had happened. I saw him once, weeks later, in the hallway near the elevators. He looked different, smaller somehow, though nothing about his physical appearance had changed. "Congratulations," he said, though his voice lacked any real warmth. "Thank you," I replied simply. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, but in the end, he just nodded and walked toward the elevator without another word. I stood there for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened, the stolen presentation, the whispered insult, the quiet, careful work of reaching out to people who deserved honest answers and letting them draw their own conclusions. I never raised my voice. I never sent an angry email. I never accused anyone publicly of anything I could not prove. I simply asked questions, the kind that honest people ask when something does not add up, and I let the truth find its own way to the surface. That evening, I went back to that same spot at the end of the office, overlooking the Chicago River. The water still looked gray under the clouds, same as it had that first morning, but something about the view felt different now. I thought about what Brady had whispered to me weeks earlier. "You're not cut out for this, Megan." Standing there, in my new role, with the sun beginning to set over the water, I finally understood something important. He had been wrong about me from the very beginning. Not because I fought back the way he expected me to, but because I didn't. I had learned, in the hardest way possible, that patience was not weakness. Quiet persistence was not the same as giving up. Sometimes the strongest response to someone stealing your voice is simply to let the truth speak louder than they ever could. Naomi found me there a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," she said, handing me one. "Thank you," I said, taking a sip. "So," she said, leaning against the railing beside me, "Senior Vice President, how does it feel?" I looked out at the river, watching the last light reflect off the water. "It feels earned," I said. "That's really all I ever wanted." Naomi smiled and raised her cup slightly, like a small, quiet toast. "To earn things, then." "To earn things," I repeated. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace settle over me. The office slowly emptied out behind us, as evening set in fully. People said their goodbyes, elevators dinged, and the building gradually grew quiet. I stayed a little longer than usual that night, not because I had extra work to finish, but because I wanted to sit with the moment a little longer. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my new role with a kind of energy I had not felt in years. I built a new innovation framework, one that gave proper credit to every team member involved, no matter how small their contribution seemed. I made sure meeting notes reflected actual ownership of ideas. I made sure junior employees felt safe bringing their ideas forward, without fear that someone above them would simply take credit and move on. Carla, Omar, and Ingrid remained loyal clients, and over time, our working relationship grew even stronger, built now on a foundation of transparency rather than assumption. Victor Lang, the new CEO, turned out to be a steady, thoughtful leader, someone who valued facts over flash, and who trusted me enough to give me real authority over major decisions moving forward. As for Brady, I heard he eventually left the regional division altogether, taking a position at a smaller company where, according to office rumors, he was still trying to rebuild the kind of reputation he had once taken for granted at Rowan Technologies. I did not feel triumphant about that. I did not feel much of anything toward him at all, honestly. Whatever anger I had once carried had slowly faded into something quieter, something closer to indifference. What stayed with me, instead, was a simple lesson I carried into every decision after that. Integrity does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, asking careful questions, giving honest people the space to see the truth clearly on their own terms. I called Odette a few weeks after the promotion, mostly just to thank her for the advice she had given me that night on the phone. She laughed softly when I told her how everything had unfolded. "I told you," she said. "Smart wins in the long run. It just asks more of you while you wait." I still think about that conversation often, especially on days when patience feels harder than usual. I still stand at that same spot by the window sometimes, especially on mornings when the office is empty and the Chicago River looks calm under a pale sky. It reminds me of where this all began and how far I had come since that whispered insult in a crowded conference room. "You're not cut out for this, Megan." I think about those words sometimes, not with anger anymore, but almost with gratitude. Because in trying to make me feel small, Brady had accidentally pushed me toward becoming exactly the kind of leader I had always hoped to be. Someone who did not need to shout to be heard. Someone who let the truth do the heavy lifting, one careful, honest question at a time.